Yo, what's up guys, it's Talon. Today I have the final role guide that I have not yet done, which is ADC. If you guys don't know who I am, I'm an autofill rank 5 sovereign player, so I play every role. I've gotten challenger on every role, again hit sovereign multiple times playing autofill only, and today we're going to give you guys a full ADC guide talking about everything from the champions you should pick, how to play with bad supports, different matchups, understanding how to team fight later on in the game, how to get as much gold in yourself as possible, and just everything that you could possibly want to know about ADC. So let's get right into it. Okay, so in terms of champions, there's a couple different ways to classify them, and it's a bit different than the average role because pretty much every ADC is a squishy champion that's focused on dealing damage, unlike other roles where you have various tanks, bruisers, mages, all these types of things, right? So the first really way that I would classify these different types of champs is between late and early game champions. So your champions like Draven, like Lucian, for example, they're going to be much more focused on the early game, really snowballing the early lane phase and playing like that. And then you have your scaling ADCs like the Xerries, the Vaynes, right, the Jinx, these types of champs that are a lot more focused on farming up, playing safely in the early game, and then getting a lot stronger later on. Now, another distinction between the two types of ADCs would be spell-based versus auto-attacking ADCs. So, for example, Varus and Ezreal are much more focused on, shooting out spells and whatnot, especially, obviously, the Poke Varus build, compared to, again, champs like Xerri or Jinx that are a lot more focused on auto-attacking. So, there's those, and then there's also ADCs versus APCs. So, you have champions, obviously, like Ziggs and Orianna, and some of these champs can be played as APCs, basically ability power carries, in lane, and then you have your normal standard ADCs, like obviously all of the ones that we know about. So those are the different distinctions kind of between a lot of the champions. When you want to pick these champs is also important to understand. For example, it's really nice to play auto-attacking champions when you have a Lulu, for example, and when you're playing an AP champion, that's going to work better with someone like Yuumi, or oftentimes AP champs are really going to prefer, ideally, to be playing with a tank oftentimes, because then they're kind of there to be able to wave clear and play pretty safe, and then allow their tanks to roam and make plays across the map. You're also going to want to keep in mind a lot of different matchups are very dependent on the support you have. So for example, champions like Yuumi are not super strong in lane, especially into a like a Thresh or any tank champions. So keeping in mind things like that your matchups are really based on your support. So just because you're a champion who maybe doesn't like, for example, Lucian does not like playing into Caitlyn, what if it's Lucian Thresh versus, say, Caitlyn and Yuumi? Well, then having that Thresh, if the Thresh is able to make plays, you're still going to be able to be perfectly fine in that matchup. So making sure that you understand kind of the differences between how these matchups work based on the different types of champions is very important. Of course, it's all super dependent, so we're not going to describe every single possible scenario that we can, because that obviously would just take too long. But generally speaking, it's nice to play those auto-attacking and those hyper-carry ADCs with enchanters who can really buff you up, and it's nice to play a lot of those more early game champions with aggressive tank supports. Same with the APCs, they often like having those tanks. That's just going to be a general overview of kind of what types of champions there are and what types of supports you're typically going to want to play with. Okay, so then shifting into kind of common starter items for most ADCs. So a lot of the ability-based champions are going to go either Manamune or Essence Reaver most commonly as their first item. For example, Varus and Ezreal again. But then the thing that I think is more interesting to talk about is the differences between starter items for crit ADCs. So crit ADCs kind of have a couple of choices most of the time. The first one is going to be Bloodthirster, which is going to be a really high damage item and is going to give you really good ability to avoid poke. Because of the fact that you get a lot of vamp, you're going to be able to avoid poke from the enemy, so you're really going to want to go the Bloodthirster when they have a lot of poke. Shield Bow is going to be a really good defensive item whenever they have or a lot of assassins, because it's going to be a lot safer. It's going to allow you to scale up nicely without being as worried about the assassins. And then Stormrazor is going to be kind of an aggressive early item that's going to be really focused on obviously catching out your enemy, and is going to be good for carrying games, but it's going to make you a bit more susceptible because it doesn't really provide much defensive value. Those are kind of going to be the three main starter items that are going to go on most champions. And then we go into the different builds. There's so many different, options based on what you see, but typically you're going to want an item like Infinity Edge or Navori Quick Blades as your third or fourth item, because these items are going to be very good once you have more crit. You're going to want an item like Blade of the Rune King into a lot of tanks, or Mortal Reminder into a lot of tanks as well. Typically, Mortal Reminder you wouldn't build until around third item, and Blade of the Rune King, if you did go, it would be a starting item, which you can go on some of these champions if you do really feel like you need that extra shred onto the tanks. Not going to go into every specific build point, but those are just some of the main points for building that are important. And then the last thing I do want to mention about building is when to build defensively. So when do you want to build a shield bow, or when do you want to get an early stasis? Typically when you have a lead is when you're going to want to get these earlier item buys, because then once you have that lead, you already have enough damage where now surviving is a much bigger deal. Whereas say that you were behind in a game, you need to make sure that you have the tools to deal as much damage as possible, because you're not going to be the main target of the team fight. And if you are targeted by the enemy, then they're making a mistake because they're wasting too many resources to kill someone who's not strong. You're going to, again, want to make sure you build more aggressively, more damage focused when you are ahead, or when you're behind rather, and you're going to want to build more defensively when you are ahead. Okay, so then moving on to the lane phase, the most important thing to keep in mind for lane phase is paying attention to your support's positioning. So you need to be on a horizontal line with your support. You don't want to be next to them. You typically want to stand on the left side of the lane, or rather on the side of the lane that's further away from the lane bush, and you want your support to usually utilize the lane bush to get poke and to potentially make engages and plays, while you're standing closer to the side of the lane that is closer to jungle. And then again, you're going to want to be on a horizontal line with them. So you're going to want to make sure that when they're able to auto attack, if it's a ranged support, you're able to auto attack at the same time. When they're backing off, you want to back off. When your engaged support is posturing aggressively for a possible engage, you need to make sure you're in a position to follow up on that, because if you are, say, way in front of your support, then you're going to get targeted by both of the lane opponents. If you're way behind them, then your support is going to get targeted by both of them. So it's extremely important to make sure that you are in a position where even if your support does make a bad engage, you're still able to get as much damage as possible off on them, which is another thing in lane. It's very important to oftentimes target the damage dealer in lane. So if your support engages onto, say, their support, and then their ADC starts hitting your support, instead of targeting that support, you're often going to want to target the ADC instead in most situations, because then you're going to be able to stop more damage and take out their damage quicker. Usually once you kill the ADC in a lane, it leads to a lot of free double kills, so that's very important to keep in mind. Now, another important thing is to understand your objective and your purpose of the lane phase. For example, if I am playing Lucian, if I am playing Draven, I need to find ways to squeeze as much as I can out of that lane, because my champion is going to fall off in later parts of the game. So especially if I'm, say, playing Lucian with a tank, right? Because if I'm playing Lucian with a Yuumi, I'm going to scale pretty well, or Lucian with a Lulu. But if I'm playing Lucian with an engaged tank, I'm not going to be as good of a scaling champion as a lot of other champs. So you're really going to want to make sure you're finding advantages. That's going to mean making sure that you're trading aggressively when your jungler is on your side of the map. Still making sure you're not playing too aggressive when the jungle's on the other side, but making sure you can find those angles and be really aggressive and squeeze for it. And then when you're in a lane where you're the scaling champion, say you're a Zarya to a Caitlyn, for example, your real goal is just to go even in that lane, make sure that, nothing bad happens, that you're able to manage your wave in a more passive way, and kind of understand just the general goal of your lane. Is it to scale? Is it to try to take advantage of the early lead? But then understand that you don't need to overforce that. A lot of times as the ADC, you have to play very reactive. You have to react to what your support does, what your jungle does. And even if you're in a lane matchup where you want to squeeze a lot out of it, if your teammates aren't allowing you to, you're just going to have to accept that and make sure that you don't bleed out too much gold, and that you still stay in a position where you can be powerful in the later parts of the game. So just being very adaptable and being very reactive is a general skill on ADC that a lot of people don't have. It's a role that requires a lot of patience. And so having that patience is immensely important. Okay guys, and something I forgot to mention about the lane phase is how important prio is. So if you don't know what prio is, it basically means having the lane pushed. So having the lane pushed because you've pushed more minions than them, the wave is closer to their tower, or you have, again, killed more minions than them, so that your minions will start pushing into theirs. The reason that prio is so important, especially at the start of the game, because the first minion of the second minion wave will get you level 2. Playing around this level 2 advantage is really important, because in bot lane, obviously, if you get level 2 and your support gets level 2 and both of the enemy are level 1, it's a way bigger advantage than in a different lane where you only have one person who has that level advantage, right? You have 4 spells to 2 instead of just 1 spell to 2 in a different lane. So playing around this level advantage by getting the prio and having prio in future parts of the lane to keep getting these level advantages earlier than your opponents is very important. So making sure that you're hitting the wave enough where it's going to push into the enemy is almost always going to be the best situation, because if you're playing into a poke lane, for example, like a Caitlyn and a Nami, and you are, say, a weaker early game champion, if you're letting them just push the wave under your turret, they're going to be able to land these spells on you really easy and poke you out under your tower, poke your turret, and all this stuff. So in those situations, it's not going to be valuable, right, to have the lane frozen, because they're usually going to punish you. Again, if you're then wanting to push the lane, if you're the aggressive lane, it's going to make sense because it's going to be easy to poke the enemy under their turret. So just generally speaking, lane priority is really an important thing in ADC because freezing is not too good due to the fact that the enemy are always going to have someone who's ranged who can easily break the freeze. Now, there are situations where you want to freeze in. For example, say the enemy has no flash in lane, right? You blew their flashes. You have an engaged support and your jungler is pathing towards you. In a situation like this, if you can freeze the lane, that's going to be really good because then you're going to be able to force the enemy to come into you, and then you're going to be able to pressure them, engage on them, and either kill them or deny them minions. So freezing is sometimes a valuable thing to do. However, in the bot lane as an ADC, it's usually going to be more important to play for prio in a lot of situations. And so I recommend, if you don't know how to manage your wave, to push it relatively fast and then use that time to make plays on other parts of the map, whether that's rotating for vision, helping your team at scuttle, maybe having your support go for a mid, gank, even if you end up staying in the lane. All of these things are kind of why prio, generally speaking, is overall better in the dual lane. Okay guys, a simple but important tip in ADC for spacing is this. Basically, make sure that you're holding down your auto attack button rather than tapping it. So why does this make sense? Basically because you can lock your targeting onto someone and then hold down your auto attack button, and as soon as you're in range with them, it will immediately stand still and auto attack them, and then you can immediately go back. So basically it's a great way to keep at the maximum range because you're holding it down, so as soon as you get in range of someone, it'll right away auto attack them. Generally, this is really good for lane phase when you're trying to space out a champion with a lot of range. For example, when I'm laning into Caitlyn, especially as a lot of champions, I'll make sure I do this because the second that she autos me and stands still, I'm able to get that value and I'm able to get that auto attack on her so that she's not able to sneak free autos in on me. And I'm basically able to utilize the fact that I have a lower range to still make sure that I am getting as many autos as someone higher range. And then when I'm a high range champion, I'm able to use it to really space people out at max range. This works great in team fights as well because, again, it just makes me able to stay at max range in team fights and stay a lot safer. Rather than when I'm tapping it, I have to go a bit closer sometimes because it's harder to tell exactly when you're going to be getting in range. So using that little simple spacing trick is actually a really effective way to just get some extra autos in. And then something that's key for any ADC is understanding how to get gold. So there's a lot of ways to get gold at different points in the game. Obviously, we talked about a lot of how to play lane phase, and that's going to help you get good gold leads. But what do we do after we, say, stomp our lane early game, right? After you have stomped your lane or, taken the first turret or whatever, you often want to find plays to rotate on the map. So for example, if you can do it, say that there is turret plates on the bottom side of the map and you took the top lane turret, which was, the lane you were in, say at 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Recall, spend that gold, grab the items that you get from getting that big advantage, and then if your support will follow you, go to the bot lane, try to ping it, try to have your top laner hopefully switch with you. Even if they don't switch, just go there if you know that you are going to have to carry this game. Basically, you can use that lane to then get extra turret plates and squeeze as much gold off the lane after you kill your turret. The downside of this is you're going to give the enemy a lot of gold on the top side because they're going to push your turret. And so I only really want you doing this in a game where you know that, the rest of your team is losing lane and you're kind of the sole person who you can trust to win the game for your team because the rest of your team is not doing too well. So those are going to be the situations where you want to go opposite side after you kill a turret really early. And then generally just playing on side lanes, catching these side waves is extremely important. I have a video about side laning that I recommend you checking out. It's very valuable on ADC to understand when you can side lane and find as much gold as possible. Playing around your item spikes as well, making sure that you're recalling when you have, say a full item or half of an item, rather than staying on the map too long. Make sure that you squeeze what you can out of the map, get that recall off to spend your gold. Don't spend, too long on the map with, thousands of gold in your back pocket because you're just going to be a lot weaker in situations like that. Okay, so the next thing to mention is kind of how to play the mid game when the early game doesn't go well, whether that's because you messed up in the lane phase, you got ganked a lot, your support sucked, whatever the reason is. You're going to find yourself in many ADC games behind quite a bit. And what do you need to do in these situations? Typically, you're going to want to play very disconnected from your team. You're going to want to really focus on catching the waves that your teammates miss, making sure you're rotating around the map to find as much gold as possible, playing for turret bounties, making sure that even if you die on a side lane that you're getting gold out of that. Generally speaking, a lot of people, when they fall behind, will just go into the mid, follow their team, and hope that they win the team fight. But the whole job of an AD carry is to deal damage. And if you don't have enough gold to deal enough damage, then what is even the point in you joining a fight? So essentially, you need to make sure you're reaching your proper item spikes or reaching your proper, break points that make your champion actually strong, and then utilizing those points to really take advantage of, your champion and be able to carry the game. So just understand kind of the power specs of your champion, and when you do fall behind, don't try to overforce fights or group with your team. Just find gold on side waves, take jungle camps, find gold whatever way you can, and then once you have reached those certain power spikes, you can then start joining the team fights and hopefully win the game that way. So we've talked about how to gold, how to lane, how to play in the mid game, early game, what champions to pick, how to play with our supports, basically everything except for the most important part of most ADCs, which is team fighting. And so I want to kind of end this video talking about how to team fight, generally speaking, on ADC. So the first really important thing is spell tracking as an ADC, and this is something that a lot of people lack and don't really take into account. So for example, the enemy say have, 5 champions. They have an assassin, they have a champion who has good CC and engage on you, and then the other champions aren't big threats. So you need to identify the biggest threats in a team fight before going into it. Typically, you either do this at the start of the game, or as the game's going on before a team fight starts. You really have to think about what champions are the most dangerous to you, and then think about what spells specifically are the most dangerous. For example, a Riven's most dangerous thing is them dashing onto you and then flashing and stunning you, and basically one-shotting you. So how would we avoid a Riven dashing onto us? Well, mobility would be the easiest way. So having our flash, for example. So we would be thinking in this fight, most likely I'm going to try to use my flash to avoid the Riven, right? And then say that they have a champ with a lot of CC. Well, maybe in this game I built QSS because I know that they have a lot of CC, and so I'm going to make sure that I have, something to avoid that CC. Maybe they have an assassin. Well, I'm going to use my exhaust when that assassin goes on me. So essentially keeping in track what in your mind, what spells you're going to use to counter the enemy spells, what stasis, again, QSS, exhaust, flash, all these types of things. How can you respond to these different things? What are the most dangerous things that you have to keep in mind and respond to the most? And what can you kind of ignore? For example, do you really need to, flash if a Mundo is on top of you? Or can you just kind of burst him down if your teammates are peeling for you and are on, are with you, basically? Keeping in track as well, like of ultimates, for example. If, again, say a Zed ults your teammate, well, now you know that Zed's not really that scary for the rest of the fight in comparison to before. So making sure that you keep track of spells, what spells you need to respond to, all of these types of things will really make team fighting a lot more straightforward and will give you a much better idea of how to play team fights as you go into them. Okay, guys, so that's going to do it for the video. Again, I just kind of want to reiterate on the team fighting, really making sure that you're keeping track of spells, making sure you're waiting for your moments, and while you're waiting, you just kind of hit the front line or just stay around your team. Having patience in general on ADC, really one of the main things that I want you guys to understand, because this is a role that's really reliant on team, and so you have to make sure that you're waiting for your team to make the plays, being patient, keeping track of spells and things like that. But yeah, that's about it. I hope that you guys enjoyed the guide. I feel like I was able to provide decent information for you guys. Hopefully this helps you in your future ADC games. I've now made a role guide for every role, but I might update my jungle one since it's about a year old. I still feel like the jungle one is pretty valuable, but I might want to update that just so it's more up to date and everything. Apart from that, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you later.